Welcome to the deep dive. Washington has certainly been buzzing with activity, hasn't it? And we're here to try and, cut through some of that noise.
Absolutely. It feels like a lot is happening all at once.
Yeah, diving right into the core of the latest congressional action.
It's true. We've seen um, significant movement on everything from these major tax proposals we're hearing about
Right.
and some pretty contentious nominations to actually a surprising number of bipartisan agreements, too,
Mm.
and resolutions addressing issues, well, as diverse as national parks and public health. It's quite a mix.
And these aren't just abstract debates happening somewhere else, right? I mean, these are decisions that could genuinely ripple through your finances, your healthcare, maybe even the natural spaces you enjoy. So let's try to unpack how Congress is navigating these complex issues, these competing priorities, and really what it all means for you. #tag legislative highlights. Okay, so let's start with what feels like one of the biggest legislative battles shaping up, this sweeping tax bill. The majority leader, speaking for his party, has called it one big, beautiful bill. What's the argument for that? What's inside?
Well, from their perspective, this bill, which came out of the Senate Finance Committee, it's fundamentally about making the 2017 Tax Cuts and Jobs Act permanent.
Okay.
So that means extending those lower tax rates for every income bracket, keeping the double child tax credit, and the nearly doubled standard deduction. All things that are actually set to expire at the end of this year if nothing changes.
Right. And if they do expire, what's the potential impact there?
Well, the projection is that without action, Americans making less than $400,000 a year could collectively face a tax hike of around $2.6 trillion.
Oh.
Yeah. So for, say, a typical family of four earning $80,000, that could translate to an extra $1,700 going to taxes. And this bill, it also proposes increasing the child tax credit by an additional $200 permanently.
So it's not just about individuals then. Businesses are a big piece of this puzzle too, I imagine.
Absolutely, a huge part.
Mm.
The bill also aims to permanently extend business tax relief.
Yeah.
So that's benefiting small and medium-sized businesses, farms, ranches.
Mm-hmm.
And it continues things like full expensing for new capital investment and domestic R&D. Proponents argue, this will really spur significant economic growth. The Council of Economic Advisors actually put out forecasts of maybe 2.9% to 3.5% long-run GDP growth.
And what does that mean in practical terms?
Well, they suggest it could potentially increase a typical family's wages by as much as $13,327. So a significant boost, according to them.
But as you mentioned, not everyone sees this bill as beautiful. The minority leader has a very different name for it, the big, ugly bill. So what's the opposing view? Why ugly?
Right. The minority leader points to different analyses, including new CBO projections. And he states these show the bill is, in his words, a loser for working and middle-class families, arguing it primarily benefits the wealthy.
Okay.
And he warns it will likely push interest rates higher, which, makes everything more expensive, buying a home, a car, sending kids to college.
He specifically laid out, I think, 5 key areas where he argues the Senate bill is particularly problematic. Let's maybe walk through those, starting with healthcare.
Yeah, healthcare is a big one. He claims the bill proposes what he describes as the biggest Medicaid cuts in U.S. history,
Wow.
potentially impacting healthcare for 60 million Americans through over $1 trillion in cuts. His concern is that it would create roadblocks for working Americans trying to get health care, put a squeeze on rural hospitals, and likely raise premiums for pretty much everyone.
Okay. And then clean energy. What's the argument there from his side?
Well, despite some earlier talk about easing cuts, the minority leader states the Senate bill actually phases out tax credits for wind and solar projects within just 6 months.
6 months. That's fast.
Very fast. And he argues that DALA could compromise U.S. energy independence, potentially handing an advantage to China. And what's really notable, he points out, is that while phasing out those clean energy credits, the bill apparently offers special tax breaks to oil and gas companies,
Oh, interesting.
making them, according to him, the only industry exempt from the alternative minimum tax, the AMT. That's a separate tax calculation meant to ensure certain high-income earners and corporations pay at least some tax.
Right. Okay. Moving on, there were some pretty strong claims about gun lobby influence in this bill as well.
Indeed. This is a really contentious point. The minority leader argues the Senate bill actually goes further than the House version. The House bill allegedly included a provision reversing about a century of safety rules on silencers. But he contends the Senate version dramatically worsens this by also dropping regulations and background checks on shotguns and rifles.
Shotguns and rifles, too.
That's the claim.
Right.
He called it stunning, terrifying, and just totally idiotic, and he stated plans to fight it hard, including using the bird bath process.
Ah, the bird bath. Remind us what that is.
It's a Senate rule, basically,
Yeah.
designed to keep non-budgetary items policy changes out of reconciliation bills, which have special procedural protections. He's arguing this gun provision is a policy change, not a revenue raiser, so it shouldn't be allowed under those rules.
Got it. And the courts. What's the concern there from the minority leader?
He claims the bill escalates what he calls House Republican attacks on the courts. So while the House bill would have apparently prevented courts from enforcing injunctions without massive security bonds being posted,
Right.
the Senate bill, he says, would prevent courts from even issuing injunctions against the federal government in the first place unless plaintiffs put up these huge security bonds.
So basically, you'd need a lot of money just to challenge the government in court.
That's the interpretation. He calls it pay-to-play and a naked attack on checks and balances. He also noted that the current administration is apparently losing about 95% of its challenged actions in court, even with Trump-appointed judges suggesting the courts are acting as a check now.
And finally, he comes back to the issue of debt and taxes again.
Yes, he sort of circles back, reiterating that the bill provides some of the largest tax cuts for the, quote, ultra-rich in American history, and he argues this will just condemn future generations to higher interest rates, higher costs, and diminished potential overall.
Okay, a lot to unpack in that tax bill debate. But beyond that, another major piece of congressional activity this week was around presidential nominations, specifically the confirmation vote for Rodney Scott as Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection, CBP. What were the arguments for his confirmation?
Well, supporters like Senator Crapo really highlighted Mr. Scott's long experience, nearly 3 decades in relevant roles, including serving as a chief patrol agent and as an associate chief in CBP's Office of Anti-Terrorism. The argument was basically that he's well-positioned. He knows the agency, he knows the mission countering terrorism, securing the border, facilitating trade.
But there was significant opposition too, right? Particularly focused on a specific incident from his past.
That's right. Senator Wyden, for instance, called it an appalling nomination. He cited Mr. Scott's alleged direct implication in a really tragic 2010 incident involving the death of a man named Anastasio Hernandez Rojas while he was in Border Patrol custody in San Diego.
What were the specific allegations?
Senator Wyden claimed that agents who were in Scott's chain of command had tampered with evidence, taped over recordings, and even used an illegal subpoena to get medical records. He also pointed out that the Inter-American Human Rights Commission concluded the U.S. government violated Mr. Rojas's family's right to access justice. And Senator Wyden didn't stop there. He brought up other alleged CBP abuses too, things like a 10-year-old U.S. citizen being left in Mexico, a family held in a windowless cell for 24 days, a 19-year-old U.S. citizen with intellectual disabilities detained for 10 days even though he was American. Really serious concerns.
But then on the other hand, there was a report from the Department of Homeland Security's own Inspector General, the OIG, that offered a different perspective on that Hernandez Rojas incident specifically. What did that report say?
Yes, the OIG review, which was referenced in the floor debate, stated it did not disclose any evidence of misconduct or violations of use of force policies by the CBP or ICE employees involved.
Interesting.
The report indicated that Mr. Rojas became, quote, verbally and physically combative and assaulted agents after his restraints were removed. And it found that the use of tasers and batons was actually in accordance with the policies at the time. So it really highlights how different investigations, different perspectives can paint such varying pictures of the same event.
It really does. So ultimately, despite the controversy, the Senate moved forward with the confirmation vote. What was the final outcome?
Mr. Scott was confirmed as Commissioner of U.S. Customs and Border Protection. The vote was 51 yeas to 46 nays, so largely along party lines.
Okay. And we also saw some procedural movements on other key nominations this week.
Yes, that's right. Cloture was invoked on Kenneth Keyes of Virginia to be an Assistant Secretary of the Treasury. That vote was 50 yeas to 46 nays.
And cloture, just to remind folks, is that vote to end debate and move to a final confirmation vote?
Exactly. It requires a simple majority now for most nominations. And there are still cloture votes pending for Daniel Zimmerman to be an Assistant Secretary of Defense that's scheduled for Monday, June 23rd, and also for Paul Debar to be Deputy Secretary of Commerce. That vote will happen sometime after Zimmerman's confirmation is dealt with.
Right. Okay, so despite all these really heated debates we've just talked about, the tax bill, the CBP nomination Congress actually managed to pass a whole package of bills through unanimous consent. which kind of showcases some bipartisan cooperation, right?
It does. And it's important not to lose sight of that. These were often less controversial, maybe more locally focused bills, things that could get broad agreement.
Like what? Can you give some examples?
Sure. There was S-282, the Katahdin Woods and Waters National Monument Access Act. That aims to provide better regional access to that monument up in Maine. It allows the Interior Secretary to acquire land, but only from willing sellers. And it specifically prohibits using eminent domain, which is, the government taking private property.
Ah, okay. That's a key distinction.
Definitely. Another one was S-356, the Secure Rural Schools Reauthorization Act of 2025. This extends critical payments to states and counties that have a lot of federal land within their borders, helping fund schools and roads.
So these are the kinds of maybe smaller legislative priorities that can actually move forward with broad support, even when the big stuff is gridlocked, making a direct impact on specific communities.
Exactly. That's a good way to put it. We also saw bills passed like H.R. 42, the Alaska Native Settlement Trust Eligibility Act. This is important and ensures that when Alaska Native elders, or those who are blind or disabled, receive dividends from their settlement trusts, they don't accidentally become ineligible for federal needs-based programs like Medicaid or SSI.
That seems like fixing an unintended consequence.
Precisely. And then there was H.R. 618, the Apex Area Technical Corrections Act, which is important for Nevada. It's designed to cut red tape and speed up the permitting process for businesses looking to build or expand in a specific industrial park near North Las Vegas. So these bills show that even a divided Congress can find common ground on these kinds of practical, often local issues.
It's good to remember that happens too. Now, beyond the floor debates and the votes, a huge amount of Congress's work happens, kind of behind the scenes in committees. What were some highlights there this week?
Committees are really the engines, you're right. We saw several key hearings in what they call executive business meetings, where they vote on bills or nominations. For example, the Appropriations Subcommittee on Defense finished up a hearing looking at the proposed budget estimates for the Army for fiscal year 2026.
Okay, groundwork for future spending.
Exactly. And the Committee on Foreign Relations was busy too. They held an executive business meeting and reported out several significant resolutions and bills.
Like what?
Well, things like S-Res 227, condemning Hamas for the October 7th attacks and demanding hostage release. Also, bills requiring strategies to respond to China's global military basing plans, and another one addressing the growing cooperation among China, Russia, Iran, and North Korea.
So significant foreign policy items moving forward.
Yes, and also providing congressional oversight for security assistance going into Mexico, and another bill pushing for more equitable treatment of Taiwan at international financial institutions like the World Bank or IMF.
And other committees were active too.
Oh, yes. Armed Services, Commerce, Energy and Natural Resources, HELP, that's Health, Education, Labor, and Pensions. They all had scheduled hearings this week, tackling their specific areas of oversight. #, political dynamics and context.
Now, beyond the actual text of legislation and the votes, the floor debates often feature some really impassioned speeches that, they illuminate the political dynamics, the divides, the pressures senators are under. Can you give us an example from this week?
Certainly. One senator spoke very passionately about the case of an Afghan interpreter. This was an individual who had served alongside U.S. troops, apparently saved American lives, whose brother was murdered back in Afghanistan, forcing him to flee.
Wow.
But he ended up entering the U.S. illegally after trying to get humanitarian visas elsewhere and was then detained by ICE out in California. All while, apparently, he was also trying to apply for a special immigrant visa, the SIV program, which is specifically for Afghans who help the U.S.
So a really complex, difficult situation.
Extremely. And the senator argued that, yes, while he violated immigration laws by crossing illegally, detaining him given his service and the circumstances was just inappropriate, it really raises that difficult question. How do we balance our immigration laws with what many see as a moral obligation to those who risked everything to help our military?
Yeah, that's a tough one. And this discussion about immigration seemed to spill over into broader critiques, maybe about political decorum and protests.
It did. The same senator who spoke about the interpreter also criticized some actions by activists protesting ICE detentions in Los Angeles. While he made a point of saying he considered Senator Padilla a friend and understood his emotions were running high at a 10 was the phrase used regarding these detentions. He suggested that leaders should come to the Senate floor and try to figure out how to get your policies through, rather than acting, quote, off the hinge or disrupting press conferences. A call for a more traditional approach, perhaps.
But then there was a very, very different perspective offered on those same Los Angeles protests from another senator, right? Much more critical of the protesters and supportive of the ICE actions.
Absolutely. A stark contrast. A different senator asserted that President Trump is focused on removing criminal illegal aliens, and that some on the left are actively trying to stop these removals. She cited polling suggesting 90% of Americans are concerned about gangs and violent criminals crossing the border.
All right.
And she pushed back hard against statements from California officials like Governor Newsom and Mayor Bass, who had called the ICE operations reckless and cruel or claimed the arrests so terror. She argued this was completely at odds with reality, especially given reports of some protesters setting vehicles on fire, looting, shooting fireworks at police, burning American flags.
Wrong language.
Very strong. She pointed to the deployment of National Guardsmen and even Marines to L.A. and noted Governor Newsom had actually sued to try and remove them. Her conclusion was that Democrats were essentially siding with criminals over law-abiding citizens. She also mentioned proposing legislation called the deportation shot clock to speed up deportations. So yeah, it really highlights a deep, deep partisan divide on immigration enforcement and the response to protests.
Definitely. Okay, shifting gears a bit, another significant area of contention we saw discussed was technology and national security. Specifically, the app TikTok came up.
Yes, TikTok continues to be a major focus. One senator described it as a significant national security threat, arguing the Chinese government actively weaponizes the platform to spread propaganda and influence Americans.
What kind of evidence was cited?
She pointed to a Rutgers University report which apparently found that TikTok's algorithm disproportionately amplified anti-Israel and anti-Semitic content. And she said that anti-Semitic comments on the platform rose something like 912% last year.
A huge increase.
Staggering, if accurate. The claim extended beyond that, too, suggesting TikTok also pushes anti-American content and has even been used in the context of what she called a trade war to encourage Americans to bypass U.S. retailers and buy directly from Chinese manufacturers.
Can she express concerns about how the administration was handling the law Congress passed regarding TikTok?
Yes, she emphasized that Congress passed a specific law requiring the divestiture, basically, the sale or transfer of TikTok source code, its training data, its algorithms, away from its Chinese parent company.
Right.
And she expressed strong concern that the administration granting extensions to the deadline for this divestiture was, in her view, illegal, and went directly against what Congress intended. She drew an analogy, saying, "We would not let a Chinese government own ABC or NBC," equating the platform's influence to that of a major news network.
Okay. Staying on the topic of technology and finance, the Genius Act, which deals with cryptocurrency and stablecoins, also drew some sharp criticism this week.
It did. One senator explained why he voted against its final passage. He argued it really missed the mark on creating sensible regulation and was sort of rushed through without allowing votes on amendments that could have strengthened it.
What were the specific concerns?
Well, one major issue was allowing foreign stablecoin issuers, like Tether, which has faced scrutiny and allegations, including links to helping Russians evade U.S. sanctions by facilitating hard-to-trace transactions to access U.S. markets under this bill.
That sounds like a significant risk.
That was the argument. He also felt the bill failed to adequately protect consumers, allowing potentially risky assets to back the stablecoins, limiting requirements for financial audits, and not giving clear authority to the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau, the CFPB.
And there were also allegations raised about sort of cryptocurrency and potential conflicts of interest, political corruption even.
That's right. The allegation, quite pointedly, was that the bill did nothing to constrain what the senator called Trump's rampant crypto corruption. He specifically mentioned things like a meme coin being marketed with promises of exclusive dinner access, and also what was described as a family stable coin, apparently used by an Emirati company for a massive $2 billion transaction. Amendments that were proposed to address these kinds of national security risks and potential conflicts of interest for government officials dealing in crypto were reportedly blocked from getting a vote.
So lots of concern there about oversight and potential loopholes. Now, despite all these really intense debates and clear partisan divides we've been discussing, Congress also managed to find some common ground, right? Often expressed through these agreed-upon resolutions. What did those moments of unity look like this week?
Yeah, it's always good to highlight those too. These resolutions often focus on areas where there's broad consensus reflecting shared national values or acknowledging specific groups or events. For instance, ESCON, Rails 15, expressed strong support for America's law enforcement professionals.
What did that entail?
It acknowledged the significant risks they face, citing things like a 54% higher suicide rate compared to other workers, and the recent decline in officer numbers, nearly 37,000 fewer between 2019 and 2021. It called for increased measures for officer safety, better training, better equipment, tougher penalties for assaulting officers, and importantly, increased mental health resources for them.
Okay. What about social or environmental issues? Was there common ground there?
There was. S-Res 288 condemned the rise in ideologically motivated attacks on Jewish individuals, specifically referencing a violent attack on a peaceful gathering in Boulder, Colorado. It reaffirmed the Senate's commitment to protecting the right to assemble peacefully and practice faith without fear.
Important statement.
And then there was S-Res 289, designating June 15th to the 22nd as National Pollinator Week. This recognized the absolutely vital role pollinators, bees, butterflies, etc., play in our agriculture and ecosystems. They contribute something like over $18 billion in revenue to U.S. crop production each year. And the resolution noted the significant declines we're seeing in species like bumblebees and monarch butterflies.
So raising awareness about that, commemorative moments were also acknowledged, weren't they?
Yes, several. S-Res 290 commemorated June 19th, 2025 as Juneteenth National Independence Day, recognizing its historical significance. And S-Res 291 celebrated the June 2025 NATO summit that was held in The Hague, reaffirming the U.S. commitment to NATO's collective defense principle under Article 5.
That NATO resolution also mentioned defense spending, right?
It did. It welcomed the increased defense spending by allies. Apparently, 23 allies now meet that 2% of GDP target, and there's an ambition among members to increase that towards 5%.
Okay. And finally, there was a resolution addressing a really critical public health issue.
Yes, S-Res 292 expressed support for World Sickle Cell Awareness Day, which is June 19th. This resolution highlighted just how significant sickle cell disease, or SCD, is. An estimated 100,000 individuals have it in the U.S., and it disproportionately impacts African-American births, about 1 in every 365.
And globally.
The numbers are stark. Globally, about 1,000 children are born with SCD every single day, mostly in Africa, and tragically, over half of them don't live past the age of 5. So the resolution called for increased public awareness, more research, better early detection, and really pushing for equitable access to treatments, a very important health equity issue. Hashtag context and analysis.
You know, listening to all this week has really given us a clear view into the different ways Congress actually operates. That whole big, beautiful bill versus big, ugly bill tax debate, for example, it really showcases the reconciliation process, doesn't it?
It absolutely does. Reconciliation is such a powerful legislative tool, mainly used for tax and spending bills because it allows them to bypass the Senate filibuster, needing only a simple majority.
That's got rules.
Exactly. It faces specific constraints, like the bird rule and the whole bird bath process we mentioned, which determines what kinds of provisions, policy versus budget, can actually be included. That's why the gun provision challenge is happening.
Right. And then on the complete other end of the spectrum, we saw the efficiency of unanimous consent for those less controversial bills.
Yeah, it's a different world. While the major legislation often gets bogged down in partisan fighting, these smaller, often more localized bills, like the Alaska Native ones or the Apex Act in Nevada, can get fast-tracked if literally no one objects. It shows the different speeds things can move out.
And the intense debates around nominations, like Rodney Scott's for CBP commissioner, that really highlights the Senate's crucial advise and consent role, particularly for these critical agency leadership positions.
Yep. It shows how an individual's record, their past actions, their statements, it all becomes central to public scrutiny and, let's be honest, partisan battling when these high-stakes confirmations come up.
Okay, so let's talk policy impact. When we look at those proposed tax changes, if they were made permanent, how could that affect different groups?
Well, proponents would say it significantly benefits millions of American families earning under $400,000, potentially saving them thousands each year. But critics, as we heard, argue it disproportionately benefits the wealthy and could exacerbate inequality. And the healthcare provisions tied to it could seriously impact access to Medicaid for vulnerable populations, and maybe even threaten the financial stability of rural hospitals if those cuts go through.
And the debates over gun regulation, those changes discussed around silencers, shotguns, rifles, the implications there seem profound.
They really are. If those provisions were to become law, it could potentially reverse nearly a century of existing safety regulations. It raises huge concerns for law enforcement groups and public safety advocates about accessibility to certain types of firearms and accessories.
Switching to immigration, those debates really touch on individual lives, like the Afghan interpreter you mentioned. It highlights the human dimension, the complexities between immigration law and humanitarian considerations.
Absolutely. And the related discussions around CBP's conduct and oversight underscore ongoing concerns about civil liberties, due process, and accountability at the border, which affects both non-citizens and citizens alike sometimes.
And the TikTok discussion, that brings up critical questions about media consumption, doesn't it? Especially for younger generations. And the potential for foreign influence on public opinion, maybe even on our economy and trade relations.
It's a huge unfolding issue. And then you have that wide range of resolutions we talked about, supporting law enforcement, recognizing Pollinator Week, addressing sickle cell awareness. It demonstrates how Congress, even amidst the big fights, attempts to reflect and act on this incredibly broad array of societal concerns, from environmental health to public safety to health disparities, # future implications.
So looking ahead, what's next for all of this? That big tax bill, the big beautiful or big ugly one? Depending on your view, that's clearly the centerpiece of an ongoing legislative battle.
Oh, absolutely. You can expect continued, really intense debate on that one, particularly around the competing economic projections, the healthcare impacts, and especially those highly controversial gun and judicial provisions. That birdbath process we discussed will be absolutely crucial in determining which parts of the bill can even survive to pass under reconciliation rules. It might force compromises or significant changes.
Right. And we'll also be watching those upcoming cloture votes for the Assistant Secretary of Defense and Deputy Secretary of Commerce nominations next week.
Yes, those votes, if they're successful, will install key leaders in the administration, shaping policy implementation in those departments. So their outcomes definitely carry weight.
Looking at the broader trends from this week, what stands out?
Well, it really highlights this persistent tension, doesn't it, between these deeply partisan ideological divides on major issues and then these sometimes unexpected moments of bipartisan consensus on other things. It's a reminder that even with significant disagreement, the machinery of government keeps grinding forward, tackling everything from global diplomacy right down to local community issues.
Yeah, it's not all one thing.
Not at all. And those debates over TikTok and crypto regulation, they really signal a growing focus and maybe struggle in Congress on how technology intersects with national security, economic stability, consumer protection. These are incredibly complex, fast-evolving issues that will almost certainly demand more and more congressional attention in the years ahead. #tag closing segment, citizen engagement.
You know, understanding what Congress is doing is really just the first step towards engaging with it. If you're curious and want to dig deeper into any of the specific bills we talked about today, a fantastic resource is congress.gov.
It really is.
You can search for the specific bill numbers we mentioned, like S-282 for that Katahdin Woods and Waters Act, or H.R. 42 for the Alaska Native Settlement Trust Eligibility Act. Or you could even just search for Tax Cuts and Jobs Act to follow that big tax debate. You'll find the full text of the bills, summaries, who sponsored them, where they are in the process. It's all there.
And if you want to voice your own thoughts on these issues, reaching out to your elected representatives, your senators, your House member, it's vital. You can easily find their contact information, usually for both their D.C. office and often local offices too, right on their official websites. That's house.gov or senate.gov.
And does it have to be a long letter?
Not at all. A brief, clear message, an email, a phone call, even a postcard, just saying what you care about and why, it can make a difference. They track constituent contacts.
Good to know. And for tracking what's happening day to day, beyondcongress.gov.
Well, C-SPAN is invaluable. They offer live and archived coverage of committee hearings, floor debates. It gives you a direct, unfiltered window into the legislative process as it happens. And definitely keep an eye out for updates on those pending cloture votes for the nominations we discussed earlier.
Okay, so this deep dive, it really reveals just how profoundly congressional actions touch our daily lives, doesn't it? From the taxes we pay to maybe the quality of our air and water, the safety of our communities.
It truly does. And it's a good reminder, I think, that democracy is about more than just casting a ballot every few years. Staying informed and engaged is part of it, too.
So here's maybe a final thought to leave you with. In this era where we talk so much about intense political division, what does it actually mean when Congress can manage to come together on issues like honoring pollinators or supporting law enforcement, but remains so deeply fundamentally divided on the big economic and social policies? And maybe What role do you think dives like this one, trying to get into the details, play in maybe shaping a more informed and perhaps more engaged citizenry? Something to think about.